Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, Keith. So what do you got today?
Yeah, I was thinking back to our previous conversation when you showed me the map of the provinces in Canada.
Show
And
missing
you had
data.
done this, right? You had done this thing with the 2 marks cards and a scaffold connection to a dimension table that had the complete list of province members. And there was one sentence in particular, one thing where I had said, I think I said, so what you're doing is you're using the monastic data as a scaffold. And you said, no, that's not what I'm doing, but we can talk about it later. And it really had me thinking, like, and trying to pick apart, like, what is a scaffold? And I realized that term monastic data is a little bit weird because I have just started using it. So I thought today we could just go through some vocabulary. And my goal.
So now's the time for that conversation.
Yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to have that conversation. And if we can get to it, my goal at the end would be to look at why I kind of agree with you that you weren't using the monastic data as a scaffold, although we could kind of see about that if you like. Okay. So again, just as a reminder, like, this is not going to be perfect, super informal. We're not really trying to be academics here. We're just really approaching this from kind of our practitioner's mindset. So let me share my screen. What I thought we could do is some canonicalization. Literally, somebody used this word in a sentence with me today, and I had never really heard it before. So I looked it up and I said, oh, that's exactly what I want to do with Jonathan. I want to canonicalize or standardize or normalize the language that we're using, so that as we use that language consistently, we can kind of have confidence that we know what we mean. So the first one, last conversation, I had introduced this idea of monastic data because I personally am trying to move away from the word master data. And I've come up with this term monastic, but we can begin with kind of the dictionary definition of master data. It's basically this consistent and uniform set of identifiers and extended attributes that describe the core entities inside of your organization, like customers or prospects. In your case, it was provinces, right? We needed a master list of all of the provinces. So like I mentioned, I'm trying to get away from the master slave concept, whitelist, blacklist, and change my vocabulary. And I've come up with this term monastic. It's my term, but I really think it applies. I'm using it in the context of like mono, meaning constant or unchanging, which is really what I think we're getting at when we think of this kind of consistent and uniform set of descriptors for the core entities. And I would sort of contrast the monastic with transient. So you've got monastic data and transient data, which kind of comes and goes.
Or another way I think about it in this definition is mono, as in one, as in single. So this is that single source of truth.
One source. Exactly. And contrast that with the more legacy traditional BI data warehousing term master data, which really I look up the dictionary definition of master and I get the power to control. So I think what they meant when they started using that word master is this was your controlling data. This was like the controlling data set. These are our list of part numbers in the company, and this is the master list of part numbers, I think is what they were getting at. And then also I've seen some attempts to kind of get away from master data and to suggest the use of primary data as another term that could be used, but I don't like that at all. Because I think it can introduce confusion, especially around like sort of ranking as if it was more important than other data, which might not necessarily be true. And also you've got your primary data source versus your secondary data source and data blending. And I just think it can get confusing if we try to use this word primary.
Yep. Yeah. And the point you just touched on about the implications of master and primary, secondary, with the sort of who is in control of that data. And we have data where like we need to have a certain list of country names that's approved by the United Nations or WHO, or like there's something like a parts list or a SKU list or something that's maintained by another group in the organization. So that is it's a master data set, but I'm not the master of it. I'm not in control of it. And to call it monastic data takes it out of that, who's in charge of the data, all of that, and just says, here's this data that is this core entity.
Yeah, this kind of constant, unchanging list of my core entities of these things inside of my organization. So, visually speaking, this is how I think of the monastic data. It's the mountain of truth, whereas the transient data is like the clouds. It can come and go. Maybe sometimes, some days it's there, and some days it isn't. So this other term that we were talking about last week was this idea of a scaffold or a skeleton data source. And so this is my definition. Just the way I think of a scaffold data source is that's separately maintained data source, often with a complete domain for the dimension members. And I'll get into in just a second what is a dimension domain. But basically, it's this separately maintained data source that is utilized together with the data you're trying to viz in order to accomplish some kind of layout or interactivity or computation calculation objective. And so if we can kind of look at that, the word scaffold, I'm a big fan of it. Like you could tell from our previous conversation, I was just trying to say scaffold. It's pretty great. And I picked it up originally from Joe Mako. He was the first person who I heard use that term. And basically the essence of what he's getting at there is that this is a temporary structure. We're using this other separately maintained data source as kind of a separate temporary structure onto which we can lay the values from our data that we're trying to visualize in order to accomplish some goal.
Yep. Looks like you got space for more terms there. So I'm curious which one's next. Oh, dimension table.
Yeah. Dimension table, right? Like if you studied this in school and you read the book, really in kind of traditional BI data warehouse formal language, this is just a dimension table. It would be our province's dimension that's hanging off of some kind of fact table in our data warehouse. One of the bummers of that might be that your audience, your people at your job, they didn't read that book and they might not know what that means. You used the word skeleton table, and I had never really heard this used before, but I just went to the dictionary language for skeleton and I saw that we're thinking of it in terms of like the bones considered as a whole forming the body's framework. So it's just basically another way of saying scaffold.
Yep. And that's one that I've seen when people are talking about this in I have this thing that I'm trying to join to, and they use that term skeleton table. And there's another one that begins with S that I've heard of that I can't remember.
Yeah. So we might not be exhaustive here, but just kind of practitioners' terms that you'll hear about. And then lastly, this is your term, the padded data source.
Yeah. So that one is, I kind of think of that. There's sort of two parts to that. There's the padding source, which is our scaffold, and then there's that viz data with it together. That's giving us that full range of values of things that we're expecting to see. So the kind of the example I like or just to use the example from our previous conversation is we had data. Not every province had data in every year.
Mm-hmm.
And so
the result of bringing together that viz data, that transient data, together with the scaffold data, the combination of those two things together is your padded data source. So it's the data source itself which has been padded
up to give us every combination of everything we care about.
Yeah. Yep. So just in a visual, this is the way I think of a scaffold.
Wow, that's an amazing scaffold.
Right? Isn't that a good scaffold? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And so then, when we talk about padding out the complete domain of a dimension, I figured we should cover what is this. Basically, the domain of a dimension is the complete set of members inside of a given dimension. So for example, in your province data, I just kind of as an example here, we might have 2019 values for Manitoba and Yukon and 2020 values for Yukon and Ontario. But notice that Manitoba and Ontario don't have complete domains across all of the years, right?
Yep.
But if we were to think of the meaning of the word domain in this particular data set that we're seeing on the screen, the domain of the province dimension is Manitoba, Yukon, and Ontario. It's the complete set of members inside of the dimension that we're working with.
Yep. And I think this points to some of the relative pieces of the language as we're using this, that we could talk about the domain of province. It's got these three values in it. The domain of year has 2019 and 2020. And then there's the domain of year and province. And in this case, not every year has every province. Not every province has every year.
Right, totally. And that's a super common scenario, which is really some of the reason why we need this sort of padding scaffolding situation. And that's what you covered last time. And so now what I want to get into is this kind of thing that you were doing. And is it scaffolding? Is it not scaffolding? So what you had done was you went out and you got your monastic data, your complete domain of all of the provinces, and you made a relationship to your transient data where on a relationship calculation where 1 is 1. And so that relationship was always true. And as I follow through kind of picking apart what you did there, basically you had your 2 marks cards on the canvas. And the reason for your 2 marks cards was because you had your 2 continuous pills. And one of those marks cards had only dimensions from the scaffold. And the other marks card had only dimensions from the data that you were trying to visualize from the transient data. And so you were never mixing and matching dimension members on the same marks card. And as we've talked about it in other conversations, each marks card is going to have its own query to the data source. And so as it turns out, when we go across this kind of one-to-one relationship, then what winds up happening is one marks card queries your transient data and the other marks card queries the scaffold data. And so now what I'd like to do is just kind of talk about, is that scaffolding? And you had said, no, that's not scaffolding. And I thought about it overnight and over the weekend, and I think you're right. That's not scaffolding, because in the way that I think Joe would use the scaffolding term is he would basically use the records of the scaffold table in order to paint the data that we're trying to visualize onto. So it's kind of like the wire structure that I would put a paper mache onto, and I'm putting the data that I'm trying to visualize onto the records from the scaffold table. And in this case, that's not what's happening. You just simply are visualizing the complete domain in one marks card and the transaction or transient data in a different marks card, but you're not taking the transaction data and painting it onto the scaffold records.
Yeah, I really like that clarification, because it gets at this piece of like what I just called like the padded data. So when you said scaffold, in my head, I translated that into padded. where we'd taken in the paper mache piece, taken our scaffold and painted the data onto it. And in this one, we're not doing that. We do have a scaffold of that monastic list of provinces. And we're using that to draw marks, but we're not using that to draw our viz data.
Right. We're not using those marks to paint our viz data onto.
Yep.
So really, we're just kind of picking it apart here, and I can't ever promise that we'll stick to this vocabulary that we decide that we're going to use. But it's good to just sort of get clear about this. I think. Can
I offer? Sometimes it helps to in thinking about this to sort of paint the picture of the knot. Or where what? So a case for, like, thinking about this data. So this is high school completion data. That's not so good. Let's say this was some sort of event data, for example. And in that case, we have a count of events. And with some of the data sets that I've worked with, like if we consider something like patient falls in the hospital, and then if we have a unit that if there's no falls reported, there's no record, there's no data. So like when I worked in the hospital, one unit that happened in was the birthing unit. Just there's the mothers who are coming in are healthy, and because they're giving birth and everything, and they're really well attended as they go on. So there's just never any falls in that unit, and then there's no data for that. But in our views, we want to show zero. We want to show a a count of zero. We want to show a rate of zero.
Yeah, you want your bars to actually have a little bar of zero width with the label 0 on it. Yeah.
Yes. Yep. And that those numbers, the denominator numbers of the patients count in our rates for when we're looking at a higher level, all of that. So in that case, that's a situation where we might have a scaffold of all of our hospital units. So the birthing unit and the intensive care unit and so on. And then we would join or relate our other data to that to create that padded, fully scaffolded
structure, that temporary structure.
Yeah, that full data source. So that's doing it that way. Whereas in the high school completion data in Canada, we just needed to show something on a map.
We just needed to render some marks, and we weren't using the marks that we rendered from that monastic table in order to paint the data onto, which would be the kind of technical definition of scaffolding. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for helping me to clear through this. I just wanted to keep an eye on the time because we're trying to keep these episodes down to 12 minutes so that people can make it to the end.
And this one's at 17 something.
17 something. So we owe you 5 minutes, everybody. We're trying for 12. It's hard. There's a lot to talk about. We'll see you next time.
We're actually going to use this in other conversations. I got some other things I want to share.
Right. Yeah.
That use this.
So we'll be going back and forth with one another.
Yep. All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Keith.
See you soon. All
right. Bye.